My name is Ted Gortney. I'm the Vice President of the CGO, and our speaker today is Dan Sullivan, who is the President of the CGO. And Dan, as you know, has been very active in supporting the whole Georgia's cause and movement in Pennsylvania and in Pittsburgh. And Dan is going to be talking about taxes. And I'm looking forward to it. And at the end of the session, then we'll open it up so that all people can ask Dan specific questions that they want to. So thank you. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, and go ahead and interrupt generally. There's probably some other criteria for judging taxes, but I think these are the ones that we most care about. And I think in kind of in that order. So I wanted to look at them. The first of which is the most progressive. A lot of times we look at who directly pays the tax, and we don't look at who is ultimately hurt by it. Look at how it correlates to the benefits, which is if one person benefits and another person pays, then that seems unfair to not necessarily the same group of people as the ones who want it to be progressive. The third is economic impact. And economic impact is, I'm talking about the overall economy. So sometimes a tax that is very progressive actually has a bad economic impact, and a tax that's very regressive has a better economic impact. Environmental impact is a very different thing. Things can have a very good economic impact, at least in the short run, and have a very bad environmental impact, and vice versa. Minimally invasive has to do with how much they have to snoop on you in order to collect the tax or assess the tax. Minimally disruptive is how much it plays havoc with your life. Transparent is, do we have to take government's word for it that they're collecting this tax honestly, or can we see it? The difficulty to avoid or cheat the tax has to do with things you can do that avoid the tax that are not necessarily good for the economy. I mean, if you avoid a tax by doing good things, we don't mind. But if you avoid the tax by doing things that hurt the economy or hurt other people in the economy, that's bad. And decentralist, can you collect this tax at the local level? And if not, can you collect it at the state level? If you have to collect it at the federal level, that's a bad thing about the tax. And implementation cost. What does it actually cost to operate the tax collecting and assessing procedure compared to how much revenue you get for it? And Ted, especially, feel free to chime in. The reason I'm bringing this up has to do with something Upton Sinclair, who is a Georgist and a socialist. He wrote a paper. It's on my website, and it's called Speculation. Something on speculation is a blight on the city and causing slums and stuff. Forget the title. I should have remembered the title for this purpose, but he was involved in a campaign in California with a guy named Luke North, who was a Georgist, who launched a very ambitious campaign and lost. And Upton Sinclair said, our opponents, the great rich bankers and land speculators of California, persuaded the poor man that we were going to put all of the taxes on this poor man's lot and to let the rich man's stocks and bonds, his inheritance, his wife's jewels, and all his income escape taxation. The poor man swallowed this argument. So I no longer advocate the single tax. I advocate many taxes. I want to tax the rich man's stocks and bonds, also his income and his inheritances and his wife's jewels. In addition, I advocate a land tax, but one graduated like the income tax. If a man or a corporation owns a great deal of land, I want to tax him on the full rental value. If he owns only one little lot, I don't want to tax him at all. And I have a problem with this. Let's work backward from it. If he only owns one little lot, I don't want to tax him at all, but he's still getting benefit that renters don't get. And if renters are paying the rent that their landlords are using for taxes, the guy with the little lot having an exemption is kind of at the exemption of the renters. Now, it will create a larger number of smaller landlords, but Henry George noted in the Irish land question that they rack rented just as badly in Belgium, which had a lot of small landlords, as they did in Ireland, which had fewer bigger landlords. So I don't know that that's a big advantage. I see a lot of gamesmanship with a man or corporation owning a great deal of land. Okay, so he parcels out his great deal of land, so his wife owns part of it, and his son owns part of it, and his daughter owns part of it, and the other son owns part of it, and he gets a dummy person to own part of it, but he holds a mortgage on it that the dummy person can't pay, so he ultimately owes it. In other words, here you have a setup that's difficult to cheat, and he's making it complicated and making it easier to cheat. He wants to tax the rich man's wife's jewels. Well, then the rich man will buy less jewelry, perhaps. But if he's not buying jewelry, he might be buying up more land. It's better that he buy jewelry and keep the jeweler employed. Inheritance, I'll talk about inheritance taxes. To the extent that they fall on land, then that's maybe useful, but they don't always. And his income, well, if you tax, Bill Gates, we're taxing his income, and what is he doing? He's buying up land all over the country. And he's buying up land that is the least taxed, and he's buying up rural, undeveloped land because he has more land than he can manage, and he doesn't even want to own land that he has to hire a real estate company to manage. He just has more money than he knows what to do with. And the best way to park that money for him is to buy land and not put it to use. And so Upton Sinclair would tax his income, but none of that land has income. That's the whole point. And the rest of us have less access to land because we have to bid against Bill Gates, who's bought up so much land and caused a shortage for the rest of us. And taxing the rich man's stocks and bonds, we'll talk about that. That's also useful to the extent that the stocks and bonds are proxies for land. If I own stock in U.S. Steel, U.S. Steel's assets are mostly land and natural resources. So that's okay, but California can't tax a rich man's stocks and bonds. He won't hold them in California. Even if he has a residence in California, he's going to hide his stocks and bonds, and California is never going to see them. So this is the problem I have with, people don't like this. Let's make it complicated and try to tax the rich for the sake of taxing the rich. I don't think it works. So that was my concern. And so we can start with what's progressive. And I think the most progressive tax is a land value tax on mineral rights. And partly because the ownership of mineral rights is far more concentrated than the ownership of surface land. That the monopoly license fees, these can be a kind of land value tax. If you know, Harry Pollard used to say that the airwaves are a type of land, and so if we tax the airwaves, or we taxed satellite positions or cable TV licenses, and did it in such a way that it would encourage them to be more competitive and not just pass on the tax, that's a progressive way. And the tax on surface land is still very progressive. We found in Pennsylvania, and I don't know that this is true everywhere, we found that land value tax fell mostly on corporate property, or far more on corporate property than property tax does. And inheritance and gift taxes are progressive mostly because we exempt a fair amount. And, you know, so your inheritance doesn't kick in for the first couple $1 million, and you can give away, I think it's close to $16,000 a year to each child, or to whoever you want to. You can give that away each year. So that's a fairly progressive tax. You can give that away without paying taxes on it, was what I needed to say. The real property tax has a reputation for being very regressive, but I think that's not true. I think it's gotten a bad rap. They usually talk about the poor person with land in a rich neighborhood. And I always say, well, it's called a rich neighborhood because there are very few poor people living there, that it's mostly rich people who live in the rich neighborhood and mostly poor people who live in the poor neighborhoods. So there are some exceptions, and those exceptions make it less progressive, but I still think it's pretty progressive. And as we get down through this list, it gradually gets less progressive. You know, there might be some we can quibble on the ranking, but within this category, there are some. Now, general wealth taxes are progressive. The problem is it includes claims to wealth. So, so the really rich manage to hide that, as I was talking about before. And asset gains taxes are normally known as capital gains. I don't call them capital gains because genuine capital doesn't gain. Genuine capital, you know, true capital, if you look in an economics dictionary, true capital is the tools and goods and service, or tools and goods that are used to enhance future production and exchange. They wear out, they get used up, they become obsolete. They almost never gain value. If you have an antique car that's more valuable than it was when it was new, that's because most of the other cars of that model rusted out or wrecked, or, you know, there's so very few of them that the one that remains is valuable. But that's because in general, they lost all their value. And yours is an exception that required a great deal of care and attention. It didn't just gain value. You put a lot of work into it. Now, the one exception to this asset gain is that if you have a company that's doing a tremendous amount of business, and because it's doing a tremendous amount of business, that company has gained value, and stock in that company has gained value. But the taxes, if you're doing a tremendous amount of business, you're employing a tremendous amount of people, you're generating a tremendous amount of taxes. And all those other taxes are far more burdensome to your business than an asset gains tax is. So, so it ranks less progressive than the other ones in this in this highly progressive category. Some of the less progressive taxes, resource extraction royalties to the degree that they're passed on. So if we put a substantial tax on oil, for example, and on coal, well, ordinary people have to heat their homes with oil and coal. Well, if they heat their homes less, then the price that the owners of the oil lands and the coal lands can extract is a little smaller, but mostly they will pay an increase in that. So that makes it less progressive. And we're going to talk about ways to get around the progressive thing. Basically, the best way to get around something being regressive is to fund a per capita dividend with it. That's what Citizens Climate Lobby realizes. They want to tax, there's resource extraction royalties, and then down below that is pollution charges. They want to tax those. And, but they want to put the money into a per capita dividend so that the people who manage to use less of it will come out with a bigger dividend than what they're paying. And that tends to make it progressive for poorer people. And so anything that's a problem with progressive, we can fix with a per capita dividend. The property tax or the land value tax also, the only problem with it is that elderly retirees pay it. And it's not as bad as they make it out to be. Oops, sorry. It's time for me to participate in another Zoom webinar that I'm going to skip. But if you say, well, okay, we're going to give retirees a per capita dividend, and it's just going to be enough that the average retiree is not going to get a tax increase when we shift to land value tax, then that solves that problem. So the progressivity thing is the easiest to solve. But corporate income tax is passed on a little bit. Personal income tax is passed on a little bit. Congestion charges fall directly on whoever's using the service at peak times. And same with user fees fall on whoever's using the service. The difference between the two, libertarians love user fees. I don't like them. I like congestion charges. If something can be funded from user fees, there's no reason for government to be doing it. So if the municipal swimming pool was going to be funded entirely from user fees, you could just have a country club with a swimming pool. You wouldn't need government involved at all. But the benefit of a municipal swimming pool is that it's good for the whole community, that the kids are not wandering around in the hot summer looking to get into trouble, that they're down swimming in the pool. And so in Pittsburgh, since they started charging user fees for swimming pools, the pools are getting underused and they're closing pools, and it's stupid because the pools were a wonderful thing for the city when they were funded from general tax revenues. Congestion charges are a little different in that if there's certain times of the day or days of the week when the swimming pool is so crowded it's becoming dangerous to swim there, then you can say, okay, we're going to charge a congestion charge on Saturday afternoons. And but the rest of the time it's free. That's essentially the difference. A toll road that's the same toll all the time is a user fee. A toll road that's only levies a toll or levies a higher toll during rush hour and then no toll at night when the road is almost empty, that's a congestion charge. And neither one of them are progressive particularly, except that richer people will probably just pay the congestion charge, and poorer people will make a point to travel at less congested times. Parking meters are user fees or congestion charges. If you only charge when at certain times of day when parking is scarce, that's a congestion charge. Flat income taxes are less progressive than obviously graduated income taxes. And excise taxes on luxuries, that's the thing that, you know, the jewelry and stuff, people think it's more progressive than it is. But what happens when it's luxuries is that rich people don't really have to buy them, and they are going to tend to buy land or do something instead. And the people who make those luxuries are going to get less employment. The most regressive taxes, sales, VAT, and gross revenue taxes. For one thing, richer people put their money, they invest a good deal of what they earn. They don't spend nearly as large a share of it on consumption items. One is that that established businesses, there's a hidden effect of sales taxes and gross revenue taxes, which is that the new business is not as profitable yet. It's trying to pay off things, and it wouldn't be generating income tax for maybe the first 7 years, but it has to generate sales tax immediately. So an income tax at least reduces the advantage that the established company has over the new competitor. A sales tax, on the other hand, encourages monopoly because Walmart, for one thing, has lower prices, so they generate less sales tax. And the competitor who maybe gives better service and the prices might be higher, he generates higher taxes. But on top of that, the competitor who's new, he's generating taxes and he hasn't made any profits yet. So there are reasons besides the fact that rich people don't spend all their money on consumables that are sales taxed. There are other reasons that sales tax is regressive. Alcohol tax, because poor people tend to drink more. Although at least with the alcohol tax, richer people buy expensive alcohol. And I don't know that poor people drink a lot more than rich people, but they smoke a lot more cigarettes than rich people. Cigarettes fall very much on poor people. And tariffs, you know, Henry George pointed out that there's only so much of a tariff you can put on diamonds before you're going to get diamond smugglers. But you can put a massive tariff on wheat or on, well, we export wheat, but you can have a massive tariff on sugar, which we have, or food from Mexico, which we don't actually have. Trump didn't actually tariff Mexico very much. He threatened to tariff Mexico, and the Mexicans worked out an agreement where they would get good trade status and they would help stop the immigrants from coming in. But we have tariffs with other countries, with China and a lot of other countries. And those tariffs get passed on to the consumers. And in addition to paying the tax, if you buy a foreign car, say there's a $1,000 tariff on a foreign car, and you buy a similarly expensive American car, you're still paying $1,000 more than you would have paid. It's just that that extra $1,000 is going to General Motors or Ford or Chrysler instead of going to the government. So tariffs transfer money to American businesses directly, and that makes them very regressive. Deed transfer taxes, I put them in here because poorer people, I don't know, very poor people rent. But of the poor, of the people who are homeowners, a person who's not particularly wealthy, if he gets a job in another area, he has to sell his old house and buy a new house, and he pays deed transfer taxes on both of them. Where a wealthier person might just say, I'm going to rent out my old house and buy a new house. A wealthy person might end up owning multiple houses somewhere, and pass his houses on to his children. Most places exempt bequests from deed transfer taxes. It's not an arm's length sale. It's parents to children. It's quite often no taxes on that. And I mentioned sales tax on necessities. Most states that have sales taxes will exempt food. A lot of them will exempt clothing. And that makes them somewhat less regressive. Although, you know, in Pennsylvania, toilet paper is exempt, but tissue paper is not. You know, there's some arbitrary things in there, and poor people need tissue paper as much as rich people do. But rich people might buy very expensive suits, and poor people buy cheaper clothes. So the exempting food and clothing isn't quite as good a thing as it's led on to be. It's a good thing though. It's just, and then, you know, they tried to get around that. They said, well, any article of clothing over $300, or we're going to tax. And so the businesses said, okay, well, here's a $500 suit. We're not going to charge $500 anymore. We're going to sell you the jacket for $300 and the pants for $200. So, you know, when you try to arbitrarily fix what was a bad tax, you're going to get arbitrary workarounds. And the most regressive tax of all is the per capita tax. In fact, the citizens' dividend is a negative per capita tax. And we have places that have per capita taxes because they're hard to evade. And most of them are per capita tax on people who have jobs rather than a per capita tax on everyone. But there are some that have a per capita tax on everyone, and that's even more regressive than a per capita tax. So that's progressivity. I was going to move on to correlates to benefits. Ted, did you have any thoughts on the progressivity?
No, you've done quite a good job, I think, of sending them out. The one thing of interest is when I was in Russia in 1992, I asked the Minister of Resources what the value of minerals in the ground were in Russia. And he said about $3 to $4 trillion.
Wow.
And I said, well, that's great, you know. And then he said, but we've only actually surveyed 3% of the land in Russia. So in reality, the minerals will be worth much more than that. That was your first, that was your most progressive item, and I just wanted to back that up.
Yeah, I'm sure they surveyed the minerals where they thought most of them were, but I'm also sure there's mineral value elsewhere. So what you're saying makes sense. So I wanted to talk about how well a tax correlates to benefits. In this case, when we did most progressive, it was mineral rights was first. And how well it correlates to benefits, I think a land value tax on surface land is first. Now, this is especially true if it's a local tax. In other words, the more services your local government provides, the more value your surface land has. I think government provision of services has very little to do with land value tax on mineral rights, although state and federal might. I think I have mineral rights far too high in this list. The land value tax on mineral rights, because people don't care whether their oil comes from Texas or Venezuela or Saudi Arabia. Not much of it comes from Saudi Arabia, by the way, except for the military gets a lot of, it's classified. We are not allowed to know for national security reasons how much oil our military consumes from Saudi Arabia, but the Saudis know. And we get almost all of our oil from Saudi Arabia. So when people say, why don't we stand up to Saudi Arabia when they pull stunts? It's because we can't. Our military is far more dependent on them than they are on us. So that's kind of a little aside, but I think, you know, I think I erred here when I put a land value tax on mineral rights. Now, the fact of the matter is that the mineral government, the title to your mineral rights originated with government in the first place. So the value of your mineral rights was initially a gift to someone from government. So there is, in that sense, a correlation to benefits. Monopoly license fees. We used to use the example of taxi cab licenses, and that's still true, but you know, Uber and Lyft and all those unlicensed haulers, ride givers have undercut the value of taxi licenses. But, you know, moving companies have monopoly licenses. The broadcast spectrum is a monopoly license and is really a land value of sorts. Those correlate somewhat to benefits, but less locally. You know, if we do things that make the county richer and you have a broadcast license in the county, it's more, your broadcast license is worth more in a wealthy county than it is in a poor county, because your advertisers can sell more stuff in a wealthy county or a wealthy state. Your broadcast license in Connecticut is worth more than a broadcast license in Alabama, for example. The real property tax, land and buildings combined, also correlates to benefits, but not as well. It's really the land value tax that correlates so beautifully to benefits that the fact that the building tax doesn't is overcome. But even the building tax, I mean, you build a nice building in a nice neighborhood. Nobody builds nice buildings in very poor neighborhoods, or very few people do. I'm in a poor neighborhood, I want to put a garage out back. That's kind of an exception, but it's minor. Congestion charges. You know, the benefit of paying a congestion charge is you don't have any congestion. So if I sit for an hour waiting to get across the Brooklyn Bridge or the Golden Gate Bridge, and they increase the congestion charges, they increase the tolls at rush hour, and I say, okay, instead of paying $3, I have to pay $10. But instead of being stuck in traffic for an hour, I roll right through it, and it saves me 50 minutes out of that hour. Well, 50 minutes is worth the $7 unless I'm very poor. So the congestion, the benefit of the congestion charge is that you've eliminated the congestion. And user fees, that's not as true. So if you have a, if you have a toll on a turnpike, in fact, I should have ranked user fees much further down. Libertarians love user fees, and this is one of the areas where I think libertarians, you're just plain wrong. When I drive on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, I don't buy gas on the turnpike because the stations have a monopoly and the gas is more expensive. So my gasoline tax is paying for all the other roads, but I'm riding on the turnpike and paying tolls for that road. So I'm paying for the road I'm using, and then I'm also paying for all the roads I'm not using. And so user fees are quite often not correlated to benefits. Maybe with the municipal swimming pool example, there's a good correlation. But on the other hand, if I don't even have any kids and I don't swim, the fact that the kids who might otherwise be making trouble in my neighborhood are having a great time at the pool benefits me too. So one of the problems of user fees is that the direct user is not the only beneficiary. The only reason government should do anything is that the direct user is not the beneficiary. It's not the only beneficiary. And that applies even to welfare. You know, there would be a lot more crime in poor neighborhoods if there was no welfare at all. We've structured welfare to do damage to family structure and things. So the way we've structured welfare causes crime. But if there were no welfare at all, there's a good chance there would be even more crime because people who are desperate are going to commit crimes. So I benefit by removing that desperation, even though I'm not getting any welfare. General wealth taxes. Here again, if I live in Pittsburgh and I have stock in Exxon doesn't do much in Pittsburgh. If you live in California and you own stock in US Steel doesn't do much in California. It does a lot in Appalachia. If all the people where US Steel owned a lot of land would charge on the land value tax, it would get a lot of money from US Steel, but it would get it for the municipalities and counties and states that suffer from US Steel's monopoly. It wouldn't get them arbitrarily. I don't know why I'm entitled to a share of a corporation that operates in Chicago or New York or California. But I think I am entitled to a share of US Steel, which is the largest landowner in Allegheny County, the county around Pittsburgh. And some excise taxes correlate cost to benefit, but they don't do a very good job. And I'm thinking about roads, gasoline taxes and excise taxes on tires and things. And there's a couple reasons for now with electric cars, it's becoming a crisis. But the other part of that is if, say, there's two people that live 18 miles from the center of Pittsburgh, and one lives on a crappy road or a crappy series of roads. If he wants to get into Pittsburgh, he has to go through, I picked out some examples, but I didn't put them up on here. He has to drive through 35 traffic lights and 7 stop signs and a tunnel. And it takes him home in about an hour. And another guy has a big superhighway built from his neighborhood right to downtown Pittsburgh. And the excise tax on the gasoline tax, the guy who has the crappy roads, it takes him an hour to get where he's going, uses a lot more gasoline. And his gasoline tax paid for that superhighway that he doesn't get. So gasoline taxes are terrible correlation to benefits in terms of when they pay for new roads. They are reasonable correlation when they pay for road maintenance. So if you have to keep patching the potholes and fixing the intersections of those roads, the correlation is not as bad. But for new roads, the correlation between gas tax or tire taxes or any of those other road use taxes is not good at all. Even a tax per mile is not very good because a mile of stopping and starting is not a benefit. But a land value tax is great for new roads. That land where they built the new superhighway, that land is worth a fortune now. And that land that is out that terrible highway, that's barely, I mean, that's half of its farmland. So land value tax is much better than excise taxes as a benefit for roads. Corporate income taxes do not correlate much to benefits, but they do to some. Personal income taxes, the same thing. Pollution charges don't correlate to benefit, and neither do resource extraction royalties correlate to benefits, but they do correlate to burdens that you have placed on society. So you're not necessarily paying an extraction royalty because you're extracting the coal as benefiting from government. You're paying the extraction royalties because you're depleting the coal, and that our future generations won't have access to it. And you're paying the pollution charge because the rest of us are breathing inferior air or dealing with inferior water because of what you did. So so those two don't correlate well to benefits, but they do correlate well to burdens. The asset gain tax correlates somewhat to benefits, and the inheritance and gift taxes correlates somewhat, but not very well. Flat income taxes, you know, if I'm earning $50,000 a year and I live in a really poor neighborhood, and another person is earning $50,000 a year and living in a really nice neighborhood, we're both paying the same taxes and we're not getting anything remotely like the same benefits. And cigarette and alcohol taxes, you know, if cigarette taxes were going entirely to subsidies for treatment of research on lung cancer, then I would run it way up there as correlating to benefits. And the same thing with alcohol taxes. If alcohol taxes were entirely rewarding victims of drunk drivers, or were treating cirrhosis of the liver, or doing something like that, I would correlate that to benefits. And the things that correlate least to benefits, the per capita tax, you pay it the same thing regardless. The deed transfer tax, again, if you know, there's no real correlation there. And tariffs, the tariffs are the same if you buy a foreign product, no matter where you live. So these we kind of went over in the other sections, and we can do that again here. The best economic impact after a tax is passed on. Land value tax on surface land has a wonderful economic impact because it puts the land to use. The rents go down, the wages go up. We saw that America became the most prosperous country in the world, mostly because we were the only advanced industrial country where the land had not been grabbed up by a feudal aristocracy. And we had people doing their best to grab it up, but there was so much land and so few people that, that the economic impact was that American industry prospered because of it. So land value tax makes land available again. That land that Bill Gates is sitting on, he would start letting go of as the taxes increased. The monopoly license fees have that same benefit, although they're smaller. Land value tax on mineral rights is the same benefit. Now, this is an economic benefit in the short run. If we had a land value tax on if we had a very high land value tax and it fell on mineral rights, the people with mineral rights would want to extract those mineral rights as quickly as possible, because as soon as they extract the minerals, then the mineral rights aren't worth much anymore, because most of the minerals worth taking have been taken out. So we'll talk about that when we talk about environmental effects. A land value tax on a land value tax on mineral rights has a terrible environmental consequence. and has to be offset by royalties on mineral rights. But the royalties on mineral rights don't have a good economic impact, and they don't do anything about monopoly. So balancing them out, but we look at economic impact first, and we say, you know, we became really prosperous when Donald Trump drove down the price of gasoline. But is that prosperity in the long run, or is that prosperity in the short run? Well, that's a separate argument. Congestion charges, they have a good economic impact, because you're not burning gasoline waiting to cross the Golden Gate Bridge. The congestion charges make everything more efficient. The real property tax, land and buildings, it still has a good economic impact, because if you look where property tax has been cut, the real property has gotten ridiculously expensive. And the #1 state for foreclosures, the 1 and 2 states for foreclosures after the crash of 2008 were Nevada and California. And depending on how you finesse it, it's California first or Nevada first. Both of them had very low real property taxes. Nevada had very low real property taxes, partly because they had gambling revenue, but the biggest impact was that they are such a mineral-rich state that they were getting, and still are getting, a lot of revenue from mineral royalties. And that enabled them to have low property taxes. But it didn't benefit the economy. Lots of people lost their homes and businesses in Nevada as well. And general wealth taxes, you know, the thing about wealth taxes is that you have to keep producing in order to keep paying the wealth taxes. Income taxes, if you don't produce, there's no income tax. So once you have a lot of wealth, you only need to generate enough income to cover your personal expenses. And so you're not going to generate a lot of income tax. And you'll just let your assets gain value. And that doesn't generate taxes. And that brings up asset gain taxes. And asset gains taxes would even be higher on this list, except for one thing, which is that usually you don't pay the tax till you realize the gains. So if you're holding land and it's going up in value, you don't pay a tax unless you sell the land. Well, that discourages people from selling the land. And it would be better for the economy if people sitting on land that they weren't using were selling it. So, those are in the best category, but the asset gains tax is not the best because it does create a perverse incentive among the very rich. Now, stocks, if you own stocks and your stocks gain in value, that's all publicly, you know, that's all on the NASDAQ averages and stuff. So they could, if they know what stocks you own, they could tax that gain in value, whether you realize it or not. But then again, you can have a holding company offshore that owns those stocks, and we have no real way of tracking that. Tolerable economic impact. Okay, the resource extraction royalties, because it does slow the economy if everybody has to pay more for that and for pollution charges. Corporate income taxes have, you know, the problem again is the corporation can buy up assets that don't generate any income, also don't create any jobs, don't produce any wealth for the rest of us. We want to encourage them to produce wealth and employ people. So corporate income taxes have that perverse incentive, and so do personal income taxes. But they're not as bad as other taxes. Cigarette and alcohol taxes, they fall on the poor, but, you know, if they discourage people from smoking and drinking, then maybe that's a good thing. Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations noticed that they didn't tax alcohol much in France, and he was under the impression that serious alcoholism, I think public drunkenness was his litmus test. That seemed to be worse to him in England than it was in France. And I thought about that, and I thought, you know, when you're thinking about having your first drink, you're thinking, well, that's with all the taxes and everything, that drink is pretty expensive. I don't know if I want that drink bad enough to pay that much money. But after the second or third drink, you can't really think about it as well because you've had a few drinks. And so I'll just have another drink, what the heck. And so, you know, I wonder if alcohol taxes discourage the first drink, but lead to binge drinking because the person hasn't had a drink in a long time, and now he's too drunk to realize that the tax is supposed to discourage him. Inheritance and gift taxes are like wealth taxes, and wealth taxes were in the first category, but they have the problem of being disruptive, and I'm going to talk about disruptive later. It's hard to build a business and pass it on to your children, and then find out that so much is going to be taken in inheritance taxes that your children can't maintain the business and have to sell it. So that's a problem. User fees are tolerable. Sometimes they're arbitrary. Sometimes they prevent a truck from going down the highway when, you know, a toll prevents a truck from going down the highway when he's not really, putting a burden on the highway during that time of day. And flat income taxes are worse because flat income taxes are closer to payroll taxes, and payroll taxes are much harder because they discourage very ordinary people. I see I have alcohol tax twice. And excise taxes on luxuries, again, the economy works better if rich people are buying luxuries and other people have jobs providing those luxuries. You know, we don't want everybody to buy luxuries necessarily, but if the people who are, you know, part of the problem with the economy is that if some people are hoarding all the money and lending it out as debt and buying up all the land, then the rest of us are we're paying the landlord and we have no way to earn the money back. So, you know, conspicuous consumption has benefit if it's the bankers and the landlords who are engaging in the conspicuous consumption, because it gives us a way to pay them back. You know, one of the tragedies of Ireland was that the absentee landlords were English and they were spending the money in England. And so the English tenants had a way to earn the money back so they could pay the next month's rent. The Irish tenants didn't have that. All they could do is export food at a time when they were starving. There's that need for money to circulate from the extractors of money, from the tribute collectors back to the wealth producers. And if you don't have that, then your economy suffers. And excise taxes on luxuries discourage the tribute collectors from giving money to the wealth producers. And the worst economic impact, I have cigarette and alcohol taxes here again, that was an error. But the sales taxes, for reasons I mentioned before, that they discourage new entrants into the businesses. The deed transfer taxes and the sales tax on necessities are also bad economic impact. And the per capita tax is bad economic impact. Now, I think I overstated that too, because The thing about a per capita tax is a poor person will do the work and pay the tax because he has no choice. It's like, you know, you can whip a slave, you can't whip a free person because a free person won't put up with that crap and will leave. But somebody who has no choice will put up with abuse. And so the per capita tax, while it should be at the worst list on the other ones, it's not really the worst economic impact, except for that poor person. But for the overall economy, these things, the sales tax on necessities and stuff, they will just somehow find a way to pay it. And it's bad for the economy in that they won't buy anything they don't need to buy. And also you're not extracting wealth from the tribute collectors, you're extracting wealth from the producers again. So that's the end of economic impact. I've gone almost an hour. Let me go really quickly through the least invasive. The land value tax is not invasive at all. You don't have to do, you can do it by computer and looking at the outside world. Pollution charges are, you have to record what people are doing, but that's just too bad. If you're polluting, you deserve to be recorded. Same with resource extraction royalties. Monopoly license fees, it's not invasive. If you don't want the license, don't pay the fee. Congestion charges are minimally invasive, in that you have to go feed the parking meter, and so you have to have coins, or you have to do minor things, but that's no big deal. And the same with user fees. They're not invasive. They're regressive sometimes. They're not invasive. Deed transfer taxes, you know, if government doesn't record your deed transfer, your property is not secure. I mean, I bought this land from this guy. Yeah, well, he sold it to me 2 years ago. You know, so now two of you think you own the land. That can't happen. So we have government register the deeds regardless. And you know, if the earth is a commons, there's the moral justification for that. But just as a practical matter, the deed transfer is by its nature kind of public. Otherwise, how do you know it's yours? You know, if you transfer an automobile, you just drive home with it and you have the paper. And if it's stolen, well, those are also registered. And land value tax on mineral rights is the same thing. And the real property tax is a little bit invasive. The assessor, as Ted knows, usually cannot go inside the building and assess but building inspectors can. So if you want to have something done that requires a building inspection, if you want to have electrical work done or your kitchen or bathroom redone, and you need a licensed plumber or electrician to do it, they have to file a building permit, and then the assessor has the information on what your building permit was worth. And the problem with that is that it gives people an incentive to do their own electrical and plumbing work. And with plumbing somewhat, and with electric even more so, you're creating a hazard by having somebody who's not qualified do the work. Because a licensed electrician can lose his license if he does work without filing permits. So he's not going to. But if you're trying to avoid a tax assessment by concealing your improvements, you quite possibly creating a public hazard at the same time. Moderately invasive taxes, corporate income taxes. Corporations have to file, especially large corporations, have to file lots of paperwork for the protection of their stockholders anyhow. You can't just do whatever you want and not produce the reports. So it's no big deal for a copy of those reports to go to the income tax collectors. And that's similar with wealth taxes. Inheritance and gift taxes are slightly more invasive. Payroll taxes are moderately invasive because you can't escape them, and the same with property taxes. They don't have to inquire too much about your paycheck because your employer is happy to deduct your taxes from it rather than make an extra profit himself. And the horribly invasive taxes, again, the asset gains taxes for a small business, personal income taxes, sales and gross revenue taxes, excise taxes, because you can cheat them. And so they have to snoop a lot to prevent them from being cheated. Small businesses, owner-operator businesses particularly, if you don't need a receipt, I won't charge you sales tax. Okay, well then you as a customer escape the sales tax, and he as a business escapes the income tax. So those kind of things trigger audits. And sales audits, not everyone is subject to a sales tax audit, but sales tax audits are far more burdensome. I've had merchants say, you have not been through hell till you've been through a sales tax audit. And tariffs, again, you have to be inspected at the border. The reason you're inspected at the border is because in case you might be smuggling something in. And a lot more people try to smuggle things without paying tariffs than are actually smuggling, drugs or guns or contraband. They're tax avoiding. That's what a lot of the smuggling is. And VAT taxes go together with tariffs. If you're in the European Union or whatever, and you're paying VAT taxes on something that you bought from Germany, that there's no tariff because you're within the VAT tax system. But as soon as you buy something that is not within the VAT tax system, the tariffs kick in. So the VAT taxes are married to the tariffs, but they're horribly invasive because every step of the way, there's a tiny bit of added value. And you not only have to say, this is what I sold and this is what I got for it, but you have to say, well, this is what I sold to this person. As a wholesaler, I sold this to this retailer and this is what I got for it. But I have to tell you that I sold it to him. And the reason I have to tell you I sold it to him is so that he can deduct what the VAT taxes he paid to me from the VAT taxes he has to pay as a sales tax. So it requires, the VAT tax in terms of paperwork is like a sales tax times 10. It's horribly burdensome to the individual person. I have some more things, but we've gone for an hour. Should we talk for a while, or should I just give them and not explain too much about what they are? Let me pick out the ones that are disruptive.
We do have a few questions that have come up.
Okay. One of the most disruptive taxes, I don't have it in here, is the inheritance tax. And the reason the inheritance tax is disruptive is you might inherit something. If you're inheriting stocks and bonds, you can sell some of them. But if you're inheriting like the Rooneys, the Rooney family owns the Pittsburgh Steelers. And when Art Rooney died, before Art Rooney died, he had been annually giving shares of the Pittsburgh Steelers to his children within the limits of the gift tax. But when he died sooner than he had hoped, I guess, and there was a 40% inheritance tax on the Pittsburgh Steelers. Well, the Pittsburgh Steelers had always been owned within the family. So they had to sell a portion of the Steelers to people who were not members of the Rooney family in order to pay the inheritance tax. So the ownership and control of that is jeopardized. And when you have a company that's got some debts and it's got to pay inheritance tax on top of that and stuff, it can break a company. So the problem with the inheritance tax is basically a wealth tax. But the a general wealth tax I have in there is only moderately disruptive. It's not a bad tax, but the inheritance tax is horribly disruptive because they ignore it and ignore it and ignore it. And when somebody dies and he's the head of the family and he might have been the head of the business, and it's the worst time to get hit with something, and that's when you have to pay the inheritance tax. So the problem with the inheritance tax, it's not regressive at all. It's a very progressive tax. And it's a lot like wealth tax, but a wealth tax is far less disruptive. So I'll skip all the other things about disruptive and go to most transparent. And again, the most transparent taxes are the same ones that they're the good taxes generally also turn out to be most transparent. The moderately transparent sometimes include regressive taxes like payroll and per capita taxes. Income taxes, it's easier to hide income taxes than payroll taxes. And one of the things about transparent is that transparency doesn't just mean that you get to see what the taxpayer is doing, which you cannot see with income tax, but you get to see what the government is doing, because the government has been forgiving people on income taxes. And they wouldn't forgive famous people because they were afraid that if they say, oh, look, this famous person got like, we forgave 90% of his income tax, there would be an outcry. So the guy who wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull, Richard Bach, he wrote a book about that called A Bridge Across Forever or A Bridge Across Tomorrow or something. But it's basically a very slightly fictionalized account, kind of the names have been changed to protect the guilty kind of thing, of his running battle with the IRS because he was, somebody lost the money he made on his book. He trusted it to, it's a typical thing. We see that with sports figures, prize fighters all the time, that they trust somebody to manage their money, and the people managing it lose all the money, but they still owe income taxes on it that they can't pay. And that was what happened with him. But if he didn't talk about it, nobody else would. And so we don't know. We don't know how much a government official has his hand out and somebody gets to evade taxes because of it. Because none of it's based on public information except the real estate tax. And the real estate tax could be even more transparent, but as it is, it's the most transparent. And again, the least transparent is asset gains that you can hide, personal income taxes that you can hide, sales and gross revenue taxes that small businesses tend to cheat on, and tariffs and VAT taxes. And they're also, I'm going to skip over the most difficult to avoid and cheat because they are very similar to the most transparent. And the most decentralist are somewhat similar because the ideal of the founders was that government would be handled at the local level as much as possible. And it's much easier to tax land value at the local level. And a poor municipality has lower land value. So if you're paying land value tax to a larger entity, your municipality pays less, and a poor neighborhood pays less. But a land value tax, you can't haul your land to the next jurisdiction. And the same thing is with these other things. So they're pretty good. Payroll taxes, you know, you can always move your businesses to the next municipality over, or to the next state. And people, you know, we're complaining of people have outsourced to other countries. Well, it takes a lot of taxes to force somebody to outsource to another country, but it doesn't take much to get them to outsource to another state. Resource extraction royalties, they can't outsource so much, but they can play games. The mine shaft is in the next municipality, but actually just between the owners and the workers, and is the mine runs under your municipality. So that's, but these other taxes are too easy to avoid to be a municipal tax. And the same is true with these other taxes. And if I'm driving a truck, if I'm driving between states anyhow, and my state has high excess taxes, I will make a point to get new tires while I'm in a low tax state, those kind of things. But the worst is tariffs, because you have to have customs agents to enforce tariffs. So that's the least decentralist. And I think I'll stop now, and let's see if let's just promote everybody, and whoever had questions, we'll ask them to talk first. So Ted, what do you think?
Dan, you have done an incredible job of reviewing all the different kinds of taxes.
That's why I wanted you to talk.
And the thing that comes to my mind just immediately is that the one tax that seemed to be the best, no matter how you examined it, was land value tax. I mean, it just going through it, it was the one that caused the least problems and most directly related to the benefits that people are receiving.
Yeah, there were one or two things on which it was not at the top, but it was always fairly near the top. Mm-hmm. And that's because I'm prejudiced, I guess. Polly, you're muted. Did you want to?
And then Dave has a question. Dave.
Okay, well, you can put everybody's camera on, and
that's what we're going to try to find how to do this.
They might have to put their own camera on as well. There's Polly and Tom, her husband.
Yeah.
So everyone can put their own camera on and take the mute off so that you can talk.
Okay, Polly?
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, pick a bone or point out, I just said the problem with property taxes is when local property taxes are used to pay for services, obviously you wind up with low rates for services in a rich district and high rates for services in a poor district, which a lot of lefties say, oh, well, that makes the property tax horribly regressive. No, that's true of any local tax. It would be true of a local income tax or a local sales tax.
Yes.
And the solution to that one is just to pay for services like education, healthcare, that kind of thing, at least partially at the state level. Of course, those services do increase local property values. So you want some local and some state level.
Yeah, the thing I looked at in Allegheny County, I looked at not the richest district, but the district that most people name is Fox Chapel. Is the name sounds rich, and in the nouveau riche all live in Fox Chapel, and I compared it to Wilkinsburg, which is the poorest district which had the highest school property tax at the time. And I said, you know, to get the same revenue per capita, they had to have about 3 times the property tax that Fox Chapel had to have. But to get the same revenue from a wage tax, they had to have over 6 times the taxes that Fox Chapel had to have. So what you're comparing is when they say, well, the wage tax or the property tax is regressive because poor neighborhoods, any local tax is going to be higher in poor neighborhoods. The other thing is that when I look at poor neighborhoods, they are always the most absentee-owned neighborhoods. So if property, as economists generally say, if land value tax particularly falls on the owners rather than the residents, then what you're doing when a poor neighborhood levies a land value tax, what they're doing is interrupting the outflow of rent from the poor neighborhood, from the tenant neighborhood to the landlord neighborhood. And so you're cutting off that outflow of rent and bring it back and putting it into your community. And to the degree that you're employing people who live in or near your community and that shop in or near your community, you're recycling that level, you're diverting that outflow of rent and bringing it back. So I always say, the first places to go to a land value tax is the poor communities. And that's what we've had in Pennsylvania. It's always been communities that were in trouble that went to a land value tax, and it's always worked for them.
Well,
So
let me just add, speaking of its work for them, there's another angle to this, which is because property taxes lower land values, it makes it easier for new people to buy in poor neighborhoods. In other words, to some extent, there is more opportunity for relatively poor people where the land values are low. And if you want the real cost is the tax plus the mortgage interest. Right. Rather than just the property tax, which makes, comparisons of tax rates a little bit misleading.
Yeah, and it also helps with the ghetto effect. The ghetto effect is poor people live in a poor neighborhood, and you have people who are from poor neighborhoods who make it in those poor neighborhoods. They, the guy goes to college, works really hard, gets a good job, is making $80,000 a year. And he says, well, if I have to pay the same wage taxes and income taxes and sales taxes on my new house in this poor ghetto that I have to pay in one of the nicest neighborhoods in my city, then I'm going to live in the nice neighborhood. Even though he's from that poor neighborhood and he has family in that poor neighborhood and he cares about that poor neighborhood. But if you have a land value tax in Pittsburgh, the land values in the richest, highest, yuppiest neighborhood in Pittsburgh are about 100 times as high as the land values in the poorest neighborhood. So he says, I'm not afraid to live in this poor neighborhood. I grew up in this poor neighborhood. They know me. They don't hate me. And I can rehab a house in this poor neighborhood and hire old friends to help me and do stuff. And I can do that. With what happens now is that as soon as somebody makes it, they move out. And then eventually the neighborhood becomes so run down that the Urban Redevelopment Authority and people move in with bulldozers, and somebody like builds a walled community on the edge of that poor neighborhood and pushes people out. And they do that with subsidies and eminent domain. And none of that is necessary. If you were on a land value tax, poor people would tend to stay in poor neighborhoods and they would make those neighborhoods richer. So
anyway, one last point on that, with the property tax being unfair to elderly or disabled homeowners, a lot of states, apart from exemptions and stuff like that, but they allow them to postpone the sale with interest until they die or move on. which is, I think is a perfectly fair solution to the problem.
Yeah, and there are also negative equity mortgages and things.
But those tend to be a ripoff.
They do tend to be a ripoff.
But then a lot of people have children that they're expecting to leave the property to, and maybe the kids could help with the taxes, but that's.
And if your children live in the same municipality, you're saving those children wage taxes. So indirectly, if you think of the property as a family asset, you're not hurting them. But if the children have moved away and they still want to own the house and you still want to leave them the house, then that's where the sense of burden comes in. But yeah, the only problem I have with tax deferrals is that sometimes the people defer the house and let it go to hell, and the deferrals add up to the point where it's not worth rehabbing. So there's an increase in abandonment that attaches to deferrals. It's not as bad as, I don't want to overstate it because it's not an epidemic, but that is like a negative side to deferrals.
Well, let's let somebody else horn in. I'm going to mute.
Okay, Dave was on the.
Oh, one of your points said land value tax on surface land. So what is the other land?
Mineral rights.
Oh.
And then there's some specialty things that I didn't get into, like rights of way, and you know, railroads are hanging on to rights of way, and they're running one train a week because that's the minimum they had to do in order to hold the right of way, and broadcast licenses and stuff. But the main one I was distinguishing was mineral rights versus surface rights. And there are some differences. And with a local tax, the biggest difference is correlation to benefits. I don't care what you're doing in the community where I own coal. You know, it's just like, if you're making the community more prosperous, it just means I'm going to have more aggravation when I want to go pull out my coal. So, so there's that.
Thanks.
Who else? Let's see. Who else had a question?
Yeah, this is Wayne Looney. I was going to maybe comment on probably one of the, most of us agree is probably one of the worst taxes, namely that per capita tax, and it has been seriously tried. I was thinking of Margaret Thatcher's poll tax that she pushed through in the 80s for local government, completely eviscerating the pre-existing, whatever pre-existing property taxes they had, and basically was a per capita head tax. And that just generated all kinds of civil unrest in Britain. But the British had done that before in some of the African colonies. And I think Cecil Rhodes pushed through something like that in the Cape Colony. And basically the idea was not so much to get revenue as to force Africans to go to work for white settlers in their mines or farms or homes or businesses, and because that's the only way they had to be paid in cash, and the only way to get actual cash was to was to actually go to work. And it's basically a way of forcing people into the money economy. People would previously be subsistence farmers, and basically put a extra burden on Native Africans.
Yeah, the good thing about the poll tax, according to Dave Wetzel, is that it ended Margaret Thatcher's career as prime minister. We have not poll tax. A poll tax is a head tax only if you vote. So it has the additional perverse incentive that it gets poor people to not vote, which makes it easier to levy the poll tax. It's a circular thing, and that was struck down as unconstitutional. But the per capita tax, we have small per capita taxes in some municipalities that they were just desperate for revenue. And it's true that poor people can't leave. So when you're not smart enough to do a land value tax, you have good progressive taxes that the rich people will leave your municipality. And then you have horrible regressive taxes, but the poor people have nowhere to go. So, so I think that's why people did poll tax or head taxes, but they were never much. You know, we had like $10 head tax a year. Well, that's terrible, but it's terrible small. So they got away with it. But that's it. Anybody else have?
We have a question from Jim Fredrickson. Jim, if you want to ask it, or I can read it for you.
Go ahead and read it.
Okay. Do you have data showing that absentee owners own a higher portion of the properties in poor neighborhoods than they do in rich neighborhoods?
I don't have it at my fingertips, and I have a lot of old data because we studied these. We studied Pittsburgh and Clairton and a lot of Western Pennsylvania cities a long time ago. And I think Josh Vincent would have data because he collects data on these things. But even from the census reports, you have percentage renters and percentage homeowners is much higher. The percentage renters is much higher in poor neighborhoods. But then when I did studies on Pittsburgh and Clairton and Duquesne and McKeesport, we looked at the addresses of the owners. And apart from mortgage properties, because Allegheny County doesn't keep the address of the owner for a mortgage company. The billing address is the mortgage company itself. But with property that has no mortgage, the absentee owned property billed to someplace outside the municipality. And we were able to look at that. And the really poor neighborhood had lots of absentee ownership. And the poor municipalities had absentee ownership. So we looked at a couple middle-class boroughs that we thought we could get interested in it. And their absentee ownership was fairly low. It was mostly commercial properties along a highway or something that were absentee owned. But the residential properties were mostly owner occupied in the richer municipalities.
Mark had a comment. Wayne brings up the issue of forced monetization, something I don't think we've ever addressed.
Forced what?
Monetization.
Well, Wayne brought up the fact of imposing a tax on African natives, forcing them into the workforce so they can earn the cash to, I think it's called the process of civilization, but it certainly has brings up the question of justice and freedom.
Okay. Something I didn't talk about, you know, if you're subsidized, if you're giving corporate welfare, almost any tax is regressive. So we built new stadiums with a sales tax, or we were going to build new stadiums with a sales tax. And no matter what tax we had chosen, maybe a land value tax, but most taxes would have been regressive no matter what, in the sense that the beneficiaries are concentrated into people who are rich enough to go to the Pirates and Steelers games. We ordinary nudniks watch them on TV or go to a bar and watch it on their TV. And the richer people watch them in the stadiums, and the really rich people have box seats and watch it that way. And so that's a subsidy to rich people no matter what. But at the other end of the spectrum, you have indigenous people who don't really want any of your government services particularly. They just want to be left to their land. And so if you have a per capita dividend, since we've pushed all the indigenous people to the poorest land anyhow, if we had a statewide or federal per capita dividend and shared it with Indian tribes, even if we also taxed their land, they would get back more in dividends than they would pay in taxes. And since they do not get and do not want our government services, that seems to solve the problem. And so that struck me as something useful in the United States, but something very useful in Central American countries and African countries where colonists are trying to impose civilization on those per capita, on those native people. That a per capita dividend would just make them independent if they, they would have the opportunity to say, civilization is much better than what we have, and they would have the opportunity to jump in and participate if they wanted to, but they could stay on their tribal lands, and their local jurisdiction would be that tribal jurisdiction. But the entire tribe would be getting dividends from richer parts of the country, richer parts of Rhodesia or Zimbabwe now, or South Africa, or any of those. So I think the per capita dividend has a lot to go for it. I don't like the way people are selling it. They want it to solve all the problems, kind of like the way Georgists want a utopian solution. So do the people pushing for per capita dividends. They say, well, it has to be at least $1,000 a month. Like $100 a month won't do any good at all. And I'm saying, well, give me your $100, because it would certainly benefit me to have $100 a month above what I have now. So that's one of the things that all movements have, that when they try to attract mass movement approach, they attract people who are less willing to compromise because it's righteous to not compromise. But boy, I really do like the per capita dividend as an incremental adjustment so that we can do other things we need to do.
Nick Rosen has a comment. Nick, do you want to say it, or should I read it?
I guess you can read it.
Okay. As forced monetization, LVT should not be imposed oppressively. Subsistence farmers should be allowed to pay in crops, which is interesting.
Well, just a minor thought of mine, I guess. I had heard of Cecil Rhodes, doing that, requiring people to pay cash tax, so they had to participate in the cash economy and work for the settlers or work in the mines, stuff like that.
And I think a per capita dividend would help with that as well.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes. Even if you have a basically good idea like LVT, there can be questions of how to administer it fairly. Has anyone else read James Scott's The Art of Not Being Governed?
No, I've not heard of it.
Well, it's mostly about Southeast Asia with comparisons to things going on elsewhere. The point is, typically tribal peoples in the hills or the swamps would try to avoid being legible to government, may make it hard for a government to figure out just what they had or what they were doing, and to tax and conscript them, maybe by being ferocious and killing any intruders, maybe in less drastic ways, while the governments of places like Thailand, Vietnam, wherever wanted people to be paddy rice growers in the lowlands because it was easy to figure out just how much rice the peasants were growing and tax them accordingly. But with different crops and gathering stuff in the jungles and or the upland forests and stuff, it was hard for a government to figure out just what was going on.
Right. People ask for the book again. What's the name of the book again?
The book is The Art of Not Being Governed.
The Art of Not Being Governed by James Scott, did you say?
James Scott.
Right.
He's a Professor Scott.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, there's something similar in China, although China's government is much more powerful than those Southeast Asian governments. But there's a saying in China that existed long before communism, which was that the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. And what that meant was that the local villages told the government what they wanted, what the government wanted to hear, and then did what the villages wanted to do. And that has been, so when they say it's communism with Chinese characteristics, that's the Chinese characteristic, that it's communism at the top, but it's people giving lip service to communism from the bottom and running their lives as much as they see fit as they can. And if they don't give the people at the top any grief or any reason to come down on them, that they do rather well that way.
Well, good for them, I think. Good for them.
Yeah, good for them if they don't get defiant. And apparently the whole Chinese culture is based on survival by not getting defiant.
I think a very good talk.